colleague and reporter and journalist in Montreal, Alex Roslin. My name is Angela Marie McDougall, and I am the Executive Director at Battered Women's Support Services, and I am here in these unceded, ancestral, and unsurrendered territories of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam people. I am so excited to have this conversation today. We've been working on this for quite a while. It's been a feature of the work that we've been doing to in terms of looking at police reform and law reform, and all of the work that we're doing around domestic violence is recognizing and understanding the role of our advocacy and support with respect to police involved domestic violence. And we're here with Alex, who is an award-winning Quebec journalist who was the president of the board of the Canadian Centre for Investigative Reporting, and his book, Police Wife, The Secret Epidemic of Domestic Violence, was a finalist for 8 book prizes, including the Reader's Favorite International Book Awards and the Arthur Ellis Awards for Excellence in Canadian Crime Writing. I am really excited to have this conversation, and just before I start asking and connecting with Alex about his work and some of the conversations that he and I have had over the years, I want to acknowledge some folks that we have in this space, and we've got viewers, and thank you for joining us all across the lands here in Canada and the US, and that we have some representatives of women who are either ex-wives or ex-girlfriends, partners, or current wives and partners of police and have experienced abuse in their relationship. So I want to acknowledge you and honor you and welcome you to here today. Thank you for being here. And I also want to acknowledge that we have some members of law enforcement, police services that that have signed up, that are declared with respect to wanting to bring more accountability within the policing, and some maybe that are wondering what we're doing, having this conversation at this particular time as there's this broad-based critique and analysis of policing in general. And we want to bring this conversation with respect to police-involved domestic violence. We do have a question and answer option for everyone here today, and you'll see at the bottom of Zoom that on the bottom here, you'll notice that there's a Q&A, and you have the chance to ask questions of Alex, which we will have some time at the end of the day, end of our time together, to ask Alex to respond. And then also there's the chat. If you want to say anything in the chat, just in general, to introduce yourself and say hi to your colleagues and where you're from, both in terms of the Indigenous territory that you are on, and then also maybe if you're working in an organization, which organization you're representing. It's wonderful to see you all. And we are live tweeting. So you saw at the top before we started that we've got our Alex is on Twitter, and you can find him as Alex Roslin. And then also we have Battered Women's Support Services, which is at Ending Violence, both on Twitter and on Instagram. And I know I've just been getting a couple of messages from folks that are saying that they're having difficulty logging on. So I think that we're just getting everybody in from the waiting room there, and looking forward to you all joining. Hello, Alex.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me.
My absolute pleasure. It's been quite wonderful to reconnect with you, and we've been talking since the summer. But the first time that we spoke was, I think, maybe like 2003, 4, something like that. And you wrote an article, which I think was called Batters in Blue. And I had the chance to comment on that for your article. How did you get here? How did you get to be the one that writes the book on police-involved domestic violence? I mean, really?
Well, it is a little strange. You're right. I should say that there have been several books written by survivors as well before my book came out, and those have very important stories, and we need more of those. the women who have experienced this kind of abuse are in a very, very difficult position, and it's very, very hard for them oftentimes to have a voice. And so hopefully with efforts like the one you're making today, and more we're seeing this, that these women are able to sort of network and get together and find support, and start to sort of build a movement that is so much needed to change things. But I started in a bizarre kind of way. My friend, I had a friend who was in a domestic violence support group, and she told me one day that something like half the people in that group were had been intimate partners with criminal biker gang members, and the other half had been involved with police officers.
Right.
And I'd been reporting on a lot of different things but this was just something that was so amazing to me that could be the case. It just and it wasn't completely surprising, but it was quite surprising in a certain way. It's such a large extent. So I started looking into it, talking to I talked to you, I talked to counselors and advocates, psychologists, and police officers themselves, actually, in Canada and the States and elsewhere. And interestingly, the police officers themselves often were among the ones talking about this the most. And I quickly found what a grave problem it was, and how widespread, and yet how very little known, and how terrifying for the women in these kinds of situations.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. And so on one hand, not a surprise, but on the other hand, still a surprise, because what we talk about here first, most definitely, is the idea that the police continue to be perceived, at least, to be a resource and an option for victims of domestic violence, and the idea that they're there to be maybe to bring be the authority figure to intervene in domestic violence situations. And I know one of the things that we have done as an organization for a long time, we've been involved in addressing the legal system as it relates to gender-based violence and the law. And we have, way back in the early 90s, were one of the organizations within Canada and the US and in Europe that was building what is now understood to be a pro-arrest policy. Here in BC, it's called the Violence Against Women in Relationships Policy. And we were part of the creation of that, which was really wanting police to be a resource for, and to, rather than showing up at domestic violence circumstances and maybe telling the abusive partner to go take a walk, we actually wanted to recognize that this was a criminal activity, that victims had a right for safety, and that there needed to be accountability. Fast forward to the 21st century, and we're starting to unravel culturally what it means to then have police who also, and based on your research, have there's these kind of epidemic levels. What are you noticing? I know that some of your research has been in the U.S. What are you noticing compared to the Canada and the U.S.?
Well, Canada is really kind of a backwater when it comes to research on this issue. I mean, we see ourselves here in Canada as being progressive, but we're not in so many different areas, and this is one of them. And so as I started doing my research right away, after I started making inquiries, there was a really horrible incident that happened in Montreal, where an RCMP officer, a veteran RCMP officer who was on the VIP protection squad, actually, with very specialized training, killed his ex-girlfriend in a shooting spree on one of Montreal's busiest highways, and shot her 5 times, injured the other passengers gravely. One of the other ones was paralyzed for life. Another one was shot 4 times. And yet this had happened after the woman had actually called police and said that her RCMP ex-boyfriend was stalking her, had threatened to kill her, had previously stalked female Mountie so badly that she quit the RCMP, and he received virtually no discipline for that and remained on the force, and as I say, was received this specialized training. And so after this happened, I was amazed also yet again by how the RCMP and the responding municipal police force didn't do anything. I mean, there was no lesson learned. There was even a wrongful death suit that had to be settled for more than $1 million, and yet the reporting was that the two officers, responding officers, weren't even disciplined for their lack of. Literally, they said that her death threat complaint was unfounded. He didn't even write a police report, didn't contact the RCMP. He kept his gun. Nothing was done. And so the judge in the case, even the defense lawyers of this RCMP officer, all said something should have been done. Something should have been done better. And maybe this woman, who was a single mom of three kids, young kids, could have perhaps survived. So I was trying to find out, how did this happen, and why could something not? How did it happen that nothing was done? And so I started looking into what had happened in the States as well, and trying to find out, other cases, and that's sort of how I proceeded with looking into this.
Mm-hmm. So grim, thoroughly and completely, and shocking in a sense, in that the lack of accountability is really embedded in how police services are responding to officer involved domestic violence. We have a couple of cases here in BC where there's been, just even here in Vancouver and the surrounding, one of the suburbs, egregious cases with police that have done horrible things to their partners and others for that matter. And there's very little accountability, or zero accountability actually, in terms of the job. And how do you make sense of the personal life of police officers and the personal life, so being abusive partners, and then the role of policing? How do you make this? I mean, it seems like that the law enforcement agencies they're not necessarily connecting those dots in a sense.
Yeah, I think that's really a very, very important thing to talk about, because it sort of explains why the rate of domestic violence is so high among police, according to research. And I should say, actually, this was sort of part of your earlier question, was what is that data? And what some very credible data that's occurred, that's come out of the United States in two different series of studies, found that 2 in 5 in one study, and about 3 in 10, so let's say 30% of officers had admitted themselves to being violent in their relationship.
In Canada.
This was in the States.
In the States.
The previous 6 months to a year. So very, very high rates, many times higher than what's reported in the wider population. And these are officers admitting it. And in one of the sets of studies was done by members of the Tucson Police Department, including a decorated police detective. So to go back to your question, the reasons for this widespread abuse, according to experts I interviewed and police officers themselves, include primarily the fact that domestic violence is about control, and it's sort of an extension of that desire to control someone else. And so, and at the same time, policing is about control. So policing, the job is all about controlling sort of a chaotic situation, or unruly individuals, let's say, and perceived to be so by the police officer, and and so imposing control through all sorts of arrays of tactics. So you could see how those tactics would sort of apply or bring themselves into the home environment fairly easily. And police officers themselves have talked about I wrote about this in my book about how policing is a controlling profession and attracts controlling people. And there are other things that are behind that widespread abuse, the impunity that you talked about, just the lack of discipline, which there's all sorts of just shocking statistics on that. How police officers, even with criminal convictions for domestic violence, are often allowed to remain on police forces. In fact, in a survey I did of dozens of police forces around the world, I think there were virtually none that said that they typically fire a police officer even after a sustained domestic violence complaint or a criminal conviction for domestic violence. And the third factor behind the widespread violence is a derogatory attitude towards women. So combine those things together, and it sort of gives you some important clues as to that question about the role of police in society, and how policing, which has these problems inherent in it, can lead to other issues that spill out beyond the police family. So there's a connection with police violence against civilians on the job, which is obviously a huge issue that we've now seen more and more, that we're recognizing. The violence that we've seen against African Americans, against African Canadians, against Indigenous people, against other marginalized people as well. And so the really change on this issue, part of the problem here is that changing it requires change on all these different levels. So it's not just a matter of reforming police forces with minor changes in policies or a better policy. We really have to look at the role of police in our society.
That's the thing that Black Lives Matter has done, hasn't it, in a sense, is it really has put in our face the necessity to explore and examine policing in our society. And here in Canada, the kind of abolition or even the defund ideas in terms of police are relatively new in terms of mainstream, and have one of the things that we've been talking about increasingly within the domestic violence or gender-based violence sector, if you will, is this idea of that police and prisons end up being sort of at the end result that we want to do more at the front end in building community-based responses. But one of the things that we know is that for women that are in relationships with police, whether as girlfriends or exes that are or wives, whether currently or as exes, they face extraordinarily big challenges in accessing support services, as well as the police apparatus works to suppress their experiences and their ability to navigate within the system for any kind of result that would increase their safety. What are you noticing when you were talking, at the beginning about your friend, and then of course all of the other women that you've spoken to through your investigation and writing of your books and other other work that you've done?
Well, and this, you've experienced this firsthand. The women who are in these positions are just so isolated and terrified in most cases. I mean, I get contacts from them around the world and all the time, and they're turning to a freelance journalist in Canada, because in their own area they don't have anywhere to turn. in many cases. You know, they don't feel comfortable. Obviously, calling 911 is just, you know, not possible in many of the cases, or they don't feel that it's going to at all help, and it, in many cases, will make things worse. Part of the abuse is very typical for the officer to tell them, you know, that you know, all my buddies know you're crazy. I've told them all how crazy you are. They're just gonna laugh at you if you call, and that's really what happens sometimes. Um, and so right off the bat, they're not very inclined to call 911. When they do, there's a whole kind of informal protocol that you know, that police officers themselves have disclosed, that I wrote about in my book, about how the complaint is sort of, rookies are indoctrinated in the idea of sort of, you know, making the complaint go away. Like, for example, encouraging the woman to sort of second guess herself. You know, do you really want to go through with this? He's going to lose his job. Then who's going to support the kids and your family? You know, stuff like that. So, and there's an important caveat to that too, which is that police officers rarely lose their job when they're accused of domestic violence. In fact, I had you know, got all sorts of access to information documents for Canadian police forces, the large, you know, some of the largest Canadian police forces, and none of them, not one single police officer accused of domestic violence, had been terminated in the last several years in those major departments. So, but nonetheless, this is what the woman is often told, right? So, and if she still goes through with it, you know, the complaint can easily be kind of botched, or the information taken down improperly, as you talked about. So it makes it harder for her to proceed with that complaint. And then, so then if it actually goes somewhere, which is very rare, then, you know, often the complaints are dealt with in the disciplinary process. And there, you know, the discipline is extremely mild. Records that I've accessed, both in Canada and the States, show that domestic violence is typically punished less severely than things like making a false statement, or theft, or failing a marijuana test, like things like that. Like, much more severely, those things are much more severely punished, and much more often lead to termination. And then, you know, if it actually goes to a trial, which is, you know, criminal trial, which is even more rare. In Canada, there was a study that found that a civilian accused of the same exact, you know, the same domestic violence crime, convicted of the same domestic violence crime as a police officer, has a 7 times higher chance of being sentenced to prison time. So right across the board, you know, that whole criminal justice system is pretty much inaccessible to most women, and that you see that in the number of complaints police departments get. I mean, they're like in the single digits or double digits a year, when even if police officers were having the same rate of domestic violence as just the wider population, forget about these rates that are like multiple times higher than the wider population. Even if it was just the same as the regular population, they should be getting about 100, for some police departments, about 100 times more complaints than they are actually getting. So, so the women are just not going there, but they often have nowhere else to turn either. I mean, shelters, they know their police officer husband will know where all the shelters are. They don't feel safe there. The typical kinds of advice that's given by counselors to other women often is inappropriate for these women, like call 911. Well, that's not going to, you know, she's not going to feel safe oftentimes doing that. There's a whole actually very interesting document prepared by a counselor in the United States called Diane Wettendorf,
Mm-hmm.
counseled many women in this situation, and she saw that the bad advice would be given so often to these women that she created an annotated safety plan which she kindly agreed to let me reproduce in my appendix. But it's online too, and it just shows you, it's actually quite shocking when you read that, because you see the extent to which these women are so isolated and living in such fear with so little access to other the usual resources, which are already lacking for other women.
Mhm. Yeah, that's Diane's work is great, and we at Battery Women Support Services actually we're starting a program that will begin. Well, it's already in effect right now, but in terms of making it more widely known, in January, that is specific for women that are experiencing police-involved domestic violence or sexual violence. And so, in recognition of the vulnerability and also the lack of the ability to access services and all of the challenges there, what we have also recognized, and that we are, I mean, currently, I checked this morning, we're working with 5 women currently that are involved with police, RCMP, municipal police. And the thing that we've seen, and the reason why I got back in contact with you and picked up your book, was because we had a situation with a local member of the Vancouver Police Department who had come to the attention of the criminal system as a result of doing domestic violence to his partner. And that case disappeared. I was told by the VPD officially that that case is closed. But how it became a problem is because that same police member was the investigative officer, the patrol officer for a domestic violence case of a woman that was accessing our services. And so, as it happens, he was doing a horrible job in his investigation. And so, we were noting how, and somebody brought it to my attention, my coworker brought it to my attention and said, listen, this is the same guy that did this, that we know about, that had done harm. And here he is on this file doing really bad work. And so that's the other piece of this. For all of those police officers, very few of them, then they may receive some advancement, get some promotions, or maybe they end up on desk duty, as I know one officer here in Vancouver is, or because the case goes away, they end up back on patrol, and they're the ones that are showing up at that 911 call when any number of the women that access our services that involve the police then are having investigating their experiences. And what an incredible, in this case, our personal experiences it's atrocious in thinking about how we can hold this member accountable to conduct the investigation as a part of his job when he's already been let off the hook from the same system for doing domestic violence.
Yeah, yeah, well, that's just so terrible, and this is exactly one of the many spillover effects or impacts of this on everybody else. We all pay for this hidden sort of state sanctioned it's domestic terrorism. State sponsored domestic terrorism is what's going on here. These women are basically facing the entire power of the state that they must combat in extremely isolating circumstances. So so these spillover effects. I mean, very well that the domestic violence is the number one, or one of the number one reasons for people to call police in many communities, and yet their number one job is completely imperiled by this just rampant domestic violence that even corrupts those officers who are not involved in it directly, because they're the ones covering it up or forced to work with these people. So how can someone who is engaging in criminal assault in their personal life deal with it professionally in the job? I mean, it's just mind-boggling that that's not more seriously addressed by police departments themselves, by municipal authorities, and so on. And it's been highlighted over and over again in various countries. The FBI did a huge report mostly for that reason, for that specific reason of the poor domestic violence response in the wider population. They did a huge report about 20 years ago, bringing together experts from various fields, including police officers and sociologists, to look at domestic violence and police relationships. And in the UK did a report more recently, which
Mhm.
talked about that nexus as well, that poor response being connected to the widespread abuse. Australia did a report that talked about that. Puerto Rico Police Department was investigated by the U.S. Department of Justice, and they talked about that. They found extremely egregious domestic abuse problem in that police force, which was not being disciplined at all almost. One amazing statistic was that 86% of officers in the Puerto Rico Police Department were still on active duty after 2 or more domestic violence arrests. That's not complaints, that's arrests. So, it just shows you how this is not being dealt with internally, and look at the impacts, right?
So then, I mean, we had a circumstance here in BC, and the Office of the Police Complaint Commission, the commissioner, Clayton Pecknold, actually went on the record as to say, because there was such little accountability for this police member's behavior. He went on the record as to say that he was quite concerned. They wanted them to go back and wanted the police to go back and take another look at the consequences that this member had for egregious behavior. I mean, he used all of his all the technology and all of the power that he had as a member of the police to stalk, to surveil, to harass his ex-partner. And what the police commissioner said was that this was clear, unless they went back and looked at the consequences, this was most likely going to have a chilling effect for victims of domestic violence in general, and thinking about how how the police can be a remedy and be a resource, and part of a women's safety plan. And so I know in your book you looked at the United States, that has done the most research and the most look at this, and then you talked about Puerto Rico as well. And yes, you and I you shared actually that report from the UK, and I've seen from Australia, but Canada is lagging in a big way in terms of looking at this. And I think even in your book you you talk about the RCMP and including the Vancouver Police Department where I am, and then I think in Ontario, and then also the OPP in Ontario, and then also then again in Montreal, and the unwillingness of the Canadian Police Services to recognize, and to let alone address what we see in terms of our work, a serious problem.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I really kind of prompted me to get into this in the first place, was the fact that in Canada, this response to this RCMP officer's murder of his ex-girlfriend in Montreal had really not provoked any change. And so the research I did on the book really kind of bore that out, that Canada is really behind the States, at least in the States. Like, look, nobody would say that they've made huge progress in the States. Like, on the ground, the women there who have who are still living this kind of nightmare are still living the same nightmare that they did 30 years ago. Hasn't changed, and it very possibly has gotten even worse, given the sort of the increased militarization of the police in the United States, and growing inequality, which is sort of part of the police role, if you will, the informal police role or the formal police role to sort of keep down, to police the marginalized communities, and so the inequality sort of exacerbates those divisions, and so you tend to see more of police presence, more police per capita in areas where there's more unemployment and more racial inequality, more gender inequality worldwide and within our countries, within Canada and the United States. So Canada, the United States hasn't really made a lot of progress. There's been some adoption of model policies, which sort of or I should say specific policies that sort of break out what the police department will do specifically differently if there has been domestic violence in a police family. So they may make say a supervisor has to attend the call, or there's no if there's no arrest, a report has to be written as to why. So these are policies that some departments have started to adopt in the States. Very, very few have actually adopted a more sort of rigorous policy that was promoted about 20 years ago by the International Association of Chiefs of Police. But some are starting to adopt some policies. So you can see there's some awareness at the very least, although it's not really translating a lot into changes or more discipline as far as I can see. However, Canada is just really it's really amazing. I mean, we're like years and years behind, even on gun control for abusers. I mean, you might think that Canada has a better record on that, but we don't, particularly for police officers. So a survey I did found that I think it was no police departments in Canada had adopted the International Association of Chiefs of Police model policy. And this is 20 years later. And I've been in touch with the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police over the years a few times. So I keep giving them a call and asking them, so, what are you doing now on this issue? And so every time I call, they don't even know what the International Association of Chiefs of Police model policy is. They weren't even aware of it, let alone promoting it to their own member departments. So, and this one case in Montreal that I talked about, nothing was done. Whereas in the States, there have been some gruesome murders, a lot of them actually in the States. One that happened not far from Vancouver was in Tacoma, Washington,
right.
in 2003.
Yes, I remember that. Yes.
Yeah, Crystal Judson was killed. She was the estranged wife of the police chief in Tacoma, Washington. And despite, lots and lots of signs that he was kind of becoming unhinged and had threatened her and was very abusive, and earlier problems, psychologists even said he shouldn't have become a police officer in the first place. This was all ignored, and he killed her in front of a very short distance from their children, very small children, and then shot himself too. And so in that case, Crystal's family, her parents, really launched sort of the first campaign on this issue. And they filed a wrongful death suit. They won a very large settlement, which included reforms, which included some of these kinds of specific policies that were adopted in the state of Washington. And they even went nationally. They convinced Congress to allocate some funding for training for police departments in this area. So that's the kind of change that happened there. There was another wrongful death suit filed after a similar case in the LAPD in the early 90s. There was a police officer who had murdered his ex-girlfriend, I believe it was, and then her new boyfriend shot himself. And there had already been previous incidents again, which is fairly typical in these cases. And in that case, because of the wrongful death suit, LAPD did an internal investigation, which found, how widespread the problem was actually of extremely lax discipline for these officers, of something like 200 complaints of domestic violence in about 5 years. Only one officer, I believe, was terminated. And so 90 of those cases were actually sustained. And if I'm not mistaken, yeah, one was terminated. So 90 were sustained, 18 led to criminal charges of those 90. Four led to convictions, and one officer was terminated. The most common discipline was suspension of 1 to 4 days or admonishment. But in Canada, we have the same problem. The RCMP disciplines domestic violence less severely than a lot of other misconduct that what anyone would say is much more mild. Like, I think making a false statement, for example.
So I know when you were writing your book, I know that you were had to FOI some information. I think it might have been the RCMP, maybe it was the VPD. I can't recall. Can you remind me about that? What was the deal that where you were seeking information, and I think it might have been the VPD, if I recall, the media person at the time. He had said, "Oh, we just don't have that problem here."
Yeah. Sorry, go on.
Yes, well, I recall that from reading your book,
Yeah.
and I actually know that media person quite well, so I chuckled because I thought, really, yeah. So what did you notice when you were doing your investigation and looking for information? Because Canada is far behind these other nation states that are looking at this issue. It seems like, and quite frankly, it doesn't want to admit that there's a problem still.
Yeah, I think, well, the states, there's been some advances, I was saying, but Canada and most other countries actually are not doing very much at all. There's been, starting to be some awareness in Australia recently. There's been quite a few cases in the news, and the UK. There's actually a major inquiry that's just started on this on domestic violence in police families. But yeah, Canada, we are really back behind any of these kinds of efforts. So I filed a freedom of or access to information request, and with several police departments, the RCMP and Vancouver. I believe Vancouver, from memory, was one of the ones that wouldn't release any information. So very, even the data, even the basic data on like discipline rates, like I wasn't asking for, particular case files of individual officers, just like how many, discipline cases have there been, how many allegations in the last year, let's say, even that kind of information they wouldn't release. Other police departments, after maybe the first time I requested it, they didn't. Then it took, a couple of years later, they changed their mind. The RCMP actually initially wanted to charge me over $20,000 for releasing basic data on discipline that now is actually available online for free. But yeah, all that kind of stuff showed that just how poorly how lax the discipline is, and including no records of terminations in the previous several years that I had that covered the records that I was requesting. Yeah, or when, for example, the RCMP, one of the things I found was the RCMP disciplines officers severely for making a false statement or for theft than domestic violence.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that a lot, and in part because the cases that we've seen here, we actually don't want those patrol members showing up at domestic violence incidents for women that end up accessing our services, because it's kind of appalling to contemplate. The police already are challenged to investigate domestic violence. Most of our time, most of the time of my coworkers is spent actually holding police accountable to conducting a proper investigation, just in a general sense. But when you've got somebody that's come to the attention of its own system for doing harm to their partners, and in some circumstances, their partners are also members of the police, it's quite troubling. We've got some questions actually, Alex, and I wonder if you have questions for those that are here, if you want to put them in the chat or answer in the Q&A, which you'll see at the bottom of the screen. But I'll read this one here. And Natasha from over here in Musqueam Territory. Hey, Natasha has asked, are there stats about the violence police officers commit against women in their family, as in sisters, mothers, aunts, nieces, grandmas, in-laws, daughters, and granddaughters, as opposed to not intimate partners, but members of their family?
Yeah, there's not a lot of data on people other than the spouse. There's very little data to begin with, and all the data is only in the States. We don't know anything in Canada about this, although police officers and others I've spoken to believe that the rates would be similar in Canada or any other country that has sort of a similar structure of police, a similar culture of police. But there is one study that was done, one of the early ones that was done in the 1990s, that was done by a sociologist, Leonore Bullion Johnson from Arizona State University, and she testified to Congress about her findings. She was actually the first person who sort of stumbled across this problem and studied it. And her study included children. So what she found was that of 728 officers who were in her study, 40% admitted that they had, and this is in quotes, gotten out of control and behaved violently toward their spouse or children in the previous 6 months. So that's the only study that I can recall right now that talked about people other than the children. Other than the spouse.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, what we've had in recently, since we've started to make it known that we are developing services specifically for victims of police-involved domestic violence, whether it's current relationships or if they're ex-partners, wives, is that we're getting a number of women that have reached out, not necessarily to access services, but wanting to create more resources. They're interested in being part of a network of police wives that could, to provide support. And so that's something that I know that we're really interested in, but there's so much vulnerability that women have in this. For most of the time, the police are prepared, their ex-partners are prepared to continue retaliation and continue doing harm in some way or another. It's quite profound, the vulnerability and the isolation that women that have experienced police-involved domestic violence, whether with a current partner or an ex, because it doesn't stop. In fact, as you've noted, the lethality can be more profound, the potential lethality after a relationship ends, and that's really what we see in the general population. And so, in your conversations with women, as you mentioned, all around the world, what are you hearing from women as far as what's needed right now in to redress this or to build, both in terms of the system of policing, but then also the system of support services?
Yeah, that's really important, I think, because I think what you're talking about, that kind of a network, is so vitally needed. And I'm so happy that that there's an interest in that and a movement towards building that, because what's just one of the many signs of how this is such a grave problem is the fact that there isn't a group like that yet, like a sort of I mean, there are groupings. I don't want to minimize what the efforts that people are already making. There are Facebook pages that are very important places for people to be able to turn to. There's there's Twitter pages by active people in this area. But there's not the kind of like larger organization, let's say, that's like a formal organization. It's sort of that exists in for most other marginalized populations, most other groups will have not just one but multiple organizations that sort of where they can find support and speak out and fight for change. And as you said, these women are in such difficult situations, often reinventing each struggle on their own each time. Each woman is reinventing it all by herself, finding out, oh my gosh, there are other people like me. I can get help. Discovering the resources that are online or elsewhere. Finding some person who can help them. And that's often how they'll start that on that path to freedom, to safety, and even to justice. And so more and more of those kinds of networks, building that momentum, I think is so important. And it's so gratifying to see that it's picking up speed. So that's, I think, probably one of the main things, but also independent advocates and counselors like you, that's so important, because that's the lifeline that these women often are lacking, and especially people who are specialized in that, who have who get the benefit of the past experience of others who have been come before, and who have the sort of the tricks of dealing with the system. Like, there's so many, all the minutia of dealing with all the different systems they have to confront. They can benefit so much from advice, from accompaniment, just support, resources, tools, that's so important. And then those systems, those support systems have to be independent of police forces, because once they are somehow connected to police forces, they can often become compromised, or and unable to help these women properly. And then women will not feel often the trust that they need to feel, to get to access those services.
Yeah, so as I was mentioning earlier on, that Battery Support Services, we have a dedicated staff member, an advocate, who is dedicated specifically for police wives, ex-wives, partners, those women or others that are dealing with police-involved domestic violence or sexualized violence. And so that is in effect right now, but we will make that more broadly known in the beginning of the new year in 2021. We have a question from Hafshah, who asks and is sending their note from Mi'kmaq territory. What are your thoughts on Justice Bastaroshi's, I'm saying that wrong, Bastaroshi's study on gender-based violence in the RCMP impact domestic violence from officers? Do you know about that report? Justice Bastaroshi's? Bastaroch?
Is this one that I'm not sure if it's one that just came out recently?
Perhaps.
Yeah, I know there was one recently on.
I just don't recognize the name. I didn't pay attention to the.
Right. Yeah.
There
yeah,
it is. That one.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. This is a really important issue, because I'm not completely familiar with all of this report, but I have followed exactly what that report is about, and this has obviously been going on a long time. This is the widespread sexual harassment and assault just other kinds of violence and abuse of female police officers in the RCMP, and which led to a very large settlement. Again, how we all pay for this kind of stuff that happens by abusive officers. So many RCMP members, women RCMP members, were subjected to this kind of abuse and these crimes. and it was covered up. The lax discipline, the same kind of stuff. Often the complainant would have her career suffer. She'd experience all sorts of trauma resulting from not just the abuse, but how the abuse was dealt with. And then the offending officer, nothing would happen oftentimes, or even get promotions, things like that. And it's very much part and parcel of the domestic violence issue among officers, because this causes are the same for both things, even if it's not the same officer doing both things. It's the fundamental, the systemic issues are the same. The police power, how much power police have in our society that we give them a blank check to do whatever they want through the impunity and the derogatory attitudes towards women. Those are three things that collide to cause both of these grave problems, and other ones too. The inappropriate domestic violence response and abuse of civilians, violence towards civilians. I just wanted to, one other thing occurred to me though, to answer to your other question about what these women want, what they tell me they want, and that is justice. That's a really hard one to achieve, but it's it's not just about getting safety, and that's obviously vitally important. That's the primordial concern, but equally primordial is the feeling that this is so wrong, and that this whole system, was arrayed against them, and that they feel so mad about that and upset that how could this happen in our society, that these so-called heroes are acting like this. The guy who's sometimes like the hero of the day kind of thing in the local newspaper, and he's going home and acting like this at home. And so I think they want justice too, and that's something that it is very hard to achieve in most of these cases, but that is a deeply felt need, I think, too.
And we'll have to end on that note. And that's in part why we often refer to the system as a legal system rather than a justice system, because justice is often elusive for victims of gender-based violence in entering the criminal system. We've got a couple more questions, but I'd like to maybe email you those, and we've got the names, and we can get back to the people. Would that be okay if I emailed you those questions so that we can answer people in another way as we need to wrap up now? Would that be okay, Alex, if we did that?
Yes, of course. And anyone who wants to get in touch with me to ask other questions or get information, you're very welcome to do that through. I have the Police Wife Facebook page and blog where there's a lot of resources, a very long extended excerpt from the book, including all sorts of advice and resources, and also on Twitter, the page you mentioned.
So we will share all of that to everyone that registered after today. Thank you, Alex, for taking the time this evening, I guess, where you are in Montreal, and having this conversation. We're beginning to further this, and I so appreciate your work and the writing of your book, Police Wife: The Secret Epidemic of Police Domestic Violence. I'm really honored for you sharing your wisdom and your experience, and thank you everyone for joining this afternoon, for staying with us, and for your questions. And I look forward to all that's next. We have a lot of work to do, I suggest. And I know you've got some exciting stuff in your writing that you're going to continue doing, and I'm very grateful for your work on this. And we must advance this. We have to create increased change.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me and for organizing this. I think it's so important, and your initiative to create that dedicated service is needs to be done by so many more people. So you're shining a light for how those organizations can do that, and you're this is a pioneering effort. I think that's sadly doesn't exist in very many places, very many agencies. So thank you so much for doing that. If I could dare to say that on behalf of the women who contact me.
Thanks, Alex. Thank you. And thanks, everyone. All the best. See you again. Farewell.
Thank you for attending, everyone.